A college student headed to her friend's party and vanished without a trace. Police jumped on the case and started turning up one chilling clue after another. But, as days turned into weeks, every promising lead fell apart. That's how it stayed for 12 years, until detectives finally learned the truth. And the way it surfaced surprised everyone. Stephanie Hummer was born on August 4, 1975, in Cincinnati, Ohio. She grew up with loving parents and two younger brothers she'd been helping to look after since she was little. In school, Stephanie really stood out, not just for straight A grades, but for how involved she was in everything. She was on the soccer and softball teams, played violin, and she genuinely loved classical music. She also got into golf, just like her dad, and even spent a few years working as a caddy at a local course. Between that experience and her academics, she earned the Evans Scholarship, also known as the Chick Evans Caddy Scholarship, one of the most prestigious scholarships in the country, the kind that covered full tuition at top schools. In 1993, when she was 18, Stephanie enrolled at Ohio State University to study landscape architecture. She slipped right into campus life, found new friends, and kept pulling excellent grades. On March 5, 1994, as Stephanie's freshman year was winding down, her parents came to visit. Her younger brother had made the finals of a math competition being held in the city, so the whole family was there to support him. Two of her best friends from back home had come, too, and that evening they were hanging out in her dorm, talking, laughing, just happy to be together. When, around midnight, two students stopped by. They were also from Cincinnati, guys they'd gone to the same high school with. Closer to 3 in the morning, the guys invited them to a party over at their dorm, about a 15-minute walk away, so everyone headed out. But, halfway there, one of the guys tried to cut through by climbing a fence and, in the dark, didn't see a sharp metal rod. He tore up his arm pretty badly, and the two of them decided to sprint back to their building to get it bandaged as fast as possible, leaving the girls on their own. At that point, Stephanie's friends figured they'd skip the party. It was late, and they had to head home in the morning. But Stephanie still wanted to drop by for a bit. Since the girls were staying in her dorm, she offered to walk them back. And even though they said they knew the way and could make it on their own, Stephanie insisted, walked them back to the building, said goodbye, and then turned around to go to the party. The dorms sat right next to campus, and the area had a pretty safe reputation. Students were out there day and night, and parties were always happening, so Stephanie wasn't worried about being out that late. She knew these streets well, she'd walked them plenty of times, and it just didn't occur to her that anything could go wrong. When her friends woke up the next morning, Stephanie still hadn't come back to the dorm. And at first, they didn't think much of it. Maybe the party ran late, or she'd crashed at the guy's dorm and would be back soon. But time kept ticking, and there was still no sign of her. The girls, who were supposed to head home that day, started to worry, because even if Stephanie had stayed over at that other dorm, she should have been back hours ago to say goodbye. By late morning, close to noon, their worry hit a breaking point, and they went to campus police. Officers reached out to Stephanie's parents, who had already left the city, and told them their daughter was missing. Her father immediately called the Columbus Police Department and they took a missing person report. As soon as officers started working the case, they heard from colleagues about a call that had come in just a few hours earlier. Around 10 in the morning, a railroad worker rolling slowly along the tracks about 4 miles from campus noticed something in the brush. He stopped to take a closer look, thinking at first it was a mannequin, but then realized he was looking at a young woman's body. He put it out over the radio and his coworkers called the police. When officers arrived, they found the victim almost completely undressed, only socks and shoes still on, with her bra looped around her neck. And there were no personal items anywhere nearby, which meant they had no way to ID her on the spot. The place where she was found had a lousy reputation, the kind of patch where dealers met buyers and sex workers turned up after dark. So the first thought was that the victim might be tied to that world. But detectives backed off that idea pretty quickly. One of them suggested she could be an Ohio State student, so they reached out to campus police. Soon, they learned Stephanie had been reported missing and got her father on the phone. He gave them a description, and detectives realized that the slain woman was most likely Stephanie. So her parents turned the car around, drove back to Columbus, and went to the morgue, where they confirmed the body was their daughter. Medical examiners determined she'd died from a blow to the head with an unknown heavy object. She'd also been sexually assaulted, and they collected a semen sample for DNA testing. The bruising on her neck looked like strangulation at first, but, on a closer look, it read more like hickeys. So they swabbed her neck for additional biological material and sent those samples to the lab along with the semen. They also put the time of death somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. Detectives spoke with Stephanie's friends, who walked them through what had happened that night, then went over to the dorm where the two guys who'd invited them to the party lived. Those guys said Stephanie never showed, and everyone else they interviewed backed it up. Investigators also asked whether either guy had been in an intimate relationship with Stephanie, since the marks on her neck didn't sit right and suggested the killer might have been someone she'd been with, that things might have started consensually and then turned when she tried to stop it. But both of them insisted Stephanie was just a friend. Detectives also noticed the bandage on one of their arms and thought it was suspicious. But he explained he'd cut himself on a fence and his friends confirmed it. And on top of that, both guys agreed to take polygraphs and provide DNA samples. So the cops crossed these guys off their list. But, soon enough, the case took a sharp turn. The lab compared the guy's DNA to the swab taken from the victim's neck and got a full match. It belonged to Thomas, the same guy who'd sliced his arm on the fence the night before. Detectives brought him right back in and laid the evidence on the table. Earlier, he'd insisted there was nothing romantic between him and Stephanie, but now he said they'd been making out that night. Which raised eyebrows, not just because he'd kept a pretty crucial detail to himself, but because everyone else who'd been in Stephanie's room swore they hadn't seen anything like that. Thomas said he'd just forgotten to mention it, claiming they'd kissed on the couch while the others were in the next room and that it hadn't gone any further, but detectives weren't buying it. They considered the possibility that he might have run into Stephanie later when she was walking across campus by herself. But then came another twist. The lab finished processing the semen collected from Stephanie's body, and it didn't match Thomas. It belonged to an unknown male who wasn't in the FBI's database, which is why detectives took Thomas off the suspect list, since the evidence pointed to someone else as the assailant. They also collected DNA from every student living in Thomas's dorm, but they didn't get a single match. Since his DNA didn't hit any database, detectives figured they might be dealing with someone on his first offense, and with what little they had, they started sketching out a timeline for that night. Because Stephanie's body was found about a 10-minute drive from her dorm, they believed the attacker struck her in the head with something heavy, loaded her into his car, and took her out to that quiet strip by the railroad tracks. In their view, he sexually assaulted her inside the car while she was unconscious, but at some point, Stephanie came to, and she may even have managed to get out and run, because the brush near where she was found was crushed down like someone had been fighting to push through it. She didn't get far, though, and he chased Stephanie down before killing her. Over the next few days, police canvassed students and people who lived in the area, hoping for anything that might break the case open, but nothing stuck. That's how it went for almost a month, until detectives finally got their first real lead. Their colleagues had arrested a man named Michael for trying to abduct a student from the same university, and investigators immediately asked the lab to compare his DNA. But to their surprise, Michael had nothing to do with Stephanie's murder. Not long after, a man came forward about his friend, a guy named Anton. According to him, a few days after the killing, Anton had asked if he could keep a very big secret, then told him that he'd been near campus the night Stephanie was killed. After that, Anton straight up confessed that he was the one who had kidnapped and murdered her. Detectives wired the friend's phone and asked him to call Anton so they could get it on tape. And not only did Anton repeat the confession, he dropped a detail that made detectives sit up. He mentioned the glow from a large TV tower you could see from the spot where the body was found. Right after that, Anton was brought in for questioning, and suddenly, he flipped the story, insisting he had nothing to do with the murder. He claimed he'd heard about it on the news and was messing with his buddy. And as for the TV tower, he said he'd been out there before and just remembered the view. None of that did much to convince detectives he was innocent, but his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. So, despite all the red flags, they crossed him off the suspect list. Not long after, the FBI joined the case, and the whole investigation kicked up a level. Detectives had already logged several reports from locals who, on the night of the murder, saw a white van cruising their streets. And that thread suddenly started to look a lot more promising. Working through ex-cons who lived near the crime scene, they landed on a man named Rodney, who'd done time for kidnappings. Back when he was locked up, they weren't collecting inmate DNA yet, so he wasn't in the FBI database. He worked for a transport company with an office right by where Stephanie's body had been found, and the company used white vans, the same kind he could get his hands on, so detectives went to talk to his coworkers. One of them told them something that made their skin crawl. Rodney had bragged about a game he liked to play, where he'd drive a work van onto campus, walk up to female students, claim he was an undercover cop, and lure them into the van, where he'd start putting his hands on them. They also spoke with Rodney's ex-girlfriend and learned she lived near Stephanie's dorm. But there's more. She said they'd broken up shortly before the murder and he hadn't taken it well at all. He'd been acting scary and clearly unstable. That was enough for a warrant to search the van he'd been using, and inside, they found handcuffs, a flashlight, and a handgun that turned out to be stolen. Rodney was arrested and brought in, but he refused to answer any questions. Even so, detectives took his DNA and sent it to the lab. But when the results came back, they could hardly believe it. Despite everything pointing his way, his DNA didn't match the semen recovered from Stephanie's body, which meant they had to cross him off the list, and just like that, they were back to nothing. From that point on, the case barely budged. Detectives kept chasing tips, and Stephanie's parents went to the media again and again, pleading with the public to come forward with anything that might help catch their daughter's killer. Almost 2 years later, police landed on a new suspect, a man arrested in California for murder and sexual assault. When investigators dug in, they learned that at the time Stephanie was killed, he'd been living near her dorm, but the DNA ruled him out. There were also several men who tried to take credit for Stephanie's murder, yet none of their DNA matched the attackers. They turned out to be inmates from the same prison, hoping to spin the case into a movie or a book deal. After that, nothing meaningful surfaced, and the investigation basically froze for years. That's how it stayed until 2005, when Ohio changed the law to collect DNA from all convicted felons. Before that, you could be stopped over and over, or even serve time for lesser offenses, and your DNA still wouldn't be in the system. Once samples were taken at booking, the database was flooded with new profiles. On January 17, 2006, a call came into Columbus PD. By then, the lead detective on Stephanie's case had retired and a new investigator had taken over. On the phone, he was told there'd just been a hit in the FBI database. A profile had been added that matched the semen recovered from Stephanie's body. It belonged to a Columbus resident named Jonathan Gravely. The investigator immediately rang his predecessor, who still hoped the case would break, and shared the news. In 12 years of work, police had never crossed his name. When they dug in, they found Jonathan lived just a 12-minute walk from campus. At the time of the murder, he was 24 and already had 2 children. And in the years since, he divorced, remarried, and had 2 more, while landing a well-paid job at a local manufacturing plant. They also learned he'd been arrested 17 times, mostly for drugs, alcohol, and DUI. But none of those cases had been serious enough back then to put his DNA into the system. That's how it went until 2006, when he got arrested yet again. But this time, the new law was in effect, so Jonathan's DNA went straight into the system. And the moment it landed there, it pinged a match to Stephanie's case. It's worth saying what actually put him in handcuffs and, in the end, tied him to a 12-year-old cold case. He'd skipped a child support payment, and his ex-wife called the police. 2 days after the hit, the new lead detective, together with the retired investigator who'd carried the case for years, showed up at Jonathan's workplace. The second they said they wanted to talk, he got visibly rattled, hands shaking, though he still agreed to come down to the station. When they told him about the DNA match, Jonathan said he had nothing to do with the murder. According to him, he met Stephanie at a bar that night, and they struck up a conversation. After a while, they decided to leave and find somewhere more private. So he drove her out away from downtown, and, he said, they had consensual sex. Detectives didn't buy it, Not only because Stephanie was 18 and the drinking age was 21, but because it made no sense that she'd ditch a party with longtime friends to wander into a bar full of strangers in the middle of the night. When they told him they didn't believe him, Jonathan shifted his story, saying things started consensually, that Stephanie initiated it, but then she suddenly changed her mind and threatened to tell his wife. An argument broke out, he hit her, and after that, he claimed everything went blank. That version didn't convince detectives either, so they laid out their own. Stephanie was walking toward her friend's dorm to hit the party when Jonathan spotted her. He owned a white van at the time, and investigators believe he pulled up alongside her on a dark, empty street, maybe opened with something harmless, like asking for directions, just enough to lower her guard. From there, they think he hit her on the head, knocked her out, loaded her into the van, and drove to the spot where her body would later be found. While she was unconscious, he stripped and sexually assaulted her. But at some point, Stephanie came to and managed to get out. Jonathan chased her down, forced her to the ground, and kept striking her in the head until she died. Even though he wouldn't admit to the abduction, he did acknowledge that he killed her, so he was arrested and the case went to court. It's worth mentioning that the judge set his bail at $1 billion, which was basically a symbolic gesture. Jonathan's attorney immediately argued that the confession was obtained illegally, that his client hadn't agreed to be questioned without a lawyer present, so they wanted to have it thrown out. Jonathan's new fiancée took his side, too, insisting he'd never hurt anyone. She believed his version, that Stephanie had consensual sex with him, left afterward, and someone else killed her. In the end, prosecutors said they'd seek the death penalty, and that's when Jonathan took a deal. They'd take death off the table if he pleaded guilty, and he accepted this deal in September 2007. The plea didn't require him to lay out the details of what happened, only to admit guilt. But even so, Jonathan stood up and addressed Stephanie's family, offering an apology for their daughter's death. They didn't buy a word of it, not for a second, and said they hoped he'd get the maximum punishment. In the end, the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, and under that sentence, he became eligible to seek parole after just 16 years. His first request came in 2023, but the board turned him down. He's still behind bars, though he has a real shot at getting out in the not-too-distant future. Stephanie's father and the people closest to her say they'll fight that every time it comes up. Sadly, her mother passed away from cancer 8 years after the verdict. To honor Stephanie, her hometown opened a small park in her name, and to this day, her family and friends still go there to remember her. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.